What if I told you that one of America's most beloved television stars lived a double life for decades, hiding a truth that could have destroyed his career? Picture this. It's 1971, and whispers are spreading through Hollywood like wildfire. Gomer Pyle, the lovable, bumbling gas station attendant who made millions of Americans laugh every single week, had supposedly married Rock Hudson, the most handsome leading man in cinema, in a secret ceremony. The rumor was so explosive, so scandalous, that it nearly ended Jim Nabors' career overnight. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming, and the revelation that Jim Nabors finally made at 87 years old will leave you absolutely stunned. This isn't just a story about Hollywood gossip. This is a story about survival, love, secrecy, and the devastating price of living authentically in an industry that demanded conformity. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will completely change how you see one of television's most iconic figures. Let's rewind in 1962, back when America was a very different place. Television screens glowed with black and white images. Families gathered around their living rooms every evening, and nobody embodied wholesome American entertainment quite like the Andy Griffith Show. Into this world of small-town values and simple pleasures came a character who would capture the nation's heart in the most unexpected way. His name was Gomer Pyle, and the man who brought him to life was Jim Nabors, a 32-year-old performer who had been working the nightclub circuit in Los Angeles, singing and doing comedy bits for whoever would listen. Jim wasn't your typical Hollywood hopeful. Born in Sylacauga, Alabama, on June 12, 1930, he grew up during the Great Depression with a quiet demeanor and a childhood marked by severe asthma that kept him from the rough-and-tumble activities other boys enjoyed. Instead, young Jim found solace in two things: singing and making people laugh. His natural comedic timing was something you couldn't teach, and his voice, that rich baritone that seemed impossibly grand coming from his lanky frame, was nothing short of extraordinary. But Hollywood in the early 60s wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for someone like Jim. He wasn't classically handsome in the way that leading men were supposed to be. He didn't have the chiseled jaw or the commanding presence. What he had was something more elusive, more genuine, an everyman quality that made audiences feel like they knew him, like he could be their neighbor or their cousin or that friendly guy who worked at the local service station. And that's exactly what caught Andy Griffith's attention one night at the Horn, a Santa Monica nightclub where Jim was performing. Griffith saw something special, something that couldn't be manufactured or faked, and he knew immediately that he wanted this performer on his show. The character of Gomer Pyle was created specifically for Jim Nabors, a naive, good-hearted gas station attendant in the fictional town of Mayberry who would utter his signature catchphrase, "Shazam!" and "Golly!" with such innocent enthusiasm that it became part of America's cultural vocabulary overnight. From his very first appearance in the episode titled The Bank Job on December 24th, 1962, something magical happened. Audiences didn't just like Gomer Pyle. They loved him with a fierce, protective affection. Here was a character who represented everything good about America, everything pure and uncomplicated and kind. He was trusting to a fault, enthusiastic about life, and possessed not a single cynical bone in his body. The character became so popular that after just 2 seasons, Jim Nabors was given his own spin-off show, Gomer Pyle, USMC, which premiered in 1964 and would run for 5 successful seasons. The premise was simple. Gomer joins the Marine Corps and brings his small-town innocence to military life, much to the consternation of his drill instructor, Sergeant Carter, played brilliantly by Frank Sutton. The show was a massive hit, ranking second in the Nielsen ratings during its debut season and maintaining solid viewership throughout its run. But here's what audiences didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined as they welcomed Gomer Pyle into their homes week after week. Behind the cameras, behind the wholesome image and the aw shucks grin, Jim Nabors was living a secret life. In an era when homosexuality was not just taboo, but literally illegal in many states, when being gay could end your career, destroy your reputation, and subject you to arrest, harassment, or worse, Jim Nabors was a gay man in Hollywood. And he wasn't alone. The entertainment industry of the 1950s and 60s was filled with closeted performers, men and women who lived double lives, who brought dates to premieres for the cameras while nurturing secret relationships behind closed doors. It was an open secret within Hollywood, this understanding that certain stars were gay, but that nobody, absolutely nobody, could acknowledge it publicly. To do so would be career suicide. The studios had entire departments dedicated to maintaining the heterosexual image of their stars, arranging fake dates, planning stories in fan magazines, and occasionally even engineering sham marriages to throw off suspicion. Rock Hudson knew this game better than almost anyone. Born Roy Harold Scherer Jr. in Winnetka, Illinois, in 1925, Hudson had been transformed by Hollywood's star-making machinery into the very embodiment of masculine perfection. At 6 feet 4 inches with classically handsome features and an easy charm, he became one of the biggest box office draws of the 1950s and 60s, starring in romantic comedies and dramas where he swept beautiful actresses off their feet. Films like Magnificent Obsession, Giant, opposite James Dean and Elizabeth Taylor, and the series of romantic comedies with Doris Day made him a household name and a symbol of American masculinity. But Hudson, too, was living a lie. He was gay, and within Hollywood's inner circles, this was known and tacitly accepted as long as it remained unspoken. His brief marriage to his agent's secretary, Phyllis Gates, from 1955 to 1958, was widely believed to have been a studio-arranged cover, a business arrangement designed to quell growing rumors about his sexuality. This is where Jim Nabors enters Rock Hudson's orbit. The two men became friends, genuinely close friends, during the height of their fame. They traveled in the same social circles, attended the same parties, and shared the same burden of maintaining a public image that contradicted their private reality. Hudson, being older and more established, reportedly took Nabors under his wing to some extent, offering advice on navigating Hollywood as a closeted gay man. They were friends with Carol Burnett, another icon of television comedy, who knew the truth about both men and provided a safe space where they could relax and be themselves. The friendship between Nabors and Hudson was real, warm, and supportive in a way that friendships often are when people share a common struggle, a common need for secrecy in an unforgiving world. But here's where things took a dark turn, where a joke among friends became a weapon that would wound Jim Nabors in ways he never anticipated. According to multiple accounts, in 1971, during a gathering of Hollywood's gay community, someone made a joke. It was supposed to be funny, a bit of dark humor among people who understood the absurdity of their situation. Someone quipped that Jim Nabors and Rock Hudson had gotten married in a secret ceremony. In the safety of that private gathering, it was a satirical comment on the impossibility of their situation, a way of laughing at the ridiculousness of a world where two famous men who were friends couldn't possibly be open about their sexualities, let alone married. But jokes have a way of escaping their intended context, and this one spread like wildfire. Within weeks, the rumor had escaped the confines of private Hollywood parties and was being whispered across the country. Jim Nabors and Rock Hudson were married. It was scandalous, it was shocking, and it was completely untrue. But in an era before internet fact-checking, before social media clarifications, rumors like this took on a life of their own. The story mutated as it spread, with people adding details, embellishing the narrative, turning a tasteless joke into an urban legend that would persist for decades. Some versions claimed the ceremony had taken place in a secret location. Others insisted that Hollywood insiders had attended. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that the rumor tapped into existing suspicions and prejudices, and it spread because people wanted to believe it, whether out of malicious glee or genuine curiosity. For Rock Hudson, who was at the height of his stardom and whose carefully constructed public image was protected by the full power of Universal Studios, the rumor was damaging but manageable. His people issued denials, dismissed it as ridiculous gossip, and his status as a major film star provided some insulation from the worst effects. But for Jim Nabors, the consequences were devastating in ways that most people never understood. Remember, Nabors wasn't a film star protected by a major studio. He was a television actor whose entire brand was built on being wholesome, innocent, and safe for family viewing. The rumor struck at the very heart of what made Gomer Pyle beloved. Suddenly, parents were wondering if they should let their children watch this man. Sponsors became nervous. Network executives started sweating. The wholesome image that had made Jim Nabors a star was now in jeopardy, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. Here's the cruelest part. Jim Nabors couldn't forcefully deny the rumor without drawing even more attention to it. He couldn't explain that, yes, he was gay, but no, he hadn't married Rock Hudson, because admitting to being gay would have ended his career just as surely as the rumor threatened to. He was trapped in an impossible situation, damned if he acknowledged it and damned if he didn't. His variety show, The Jim Nabors Hour, which had debuted in 1969 on CBS and featured musical performances showcasing his incredible singing voice, was canceled after just 2 seasons in 1971, right around the time the rumor was spreading. While the official reason given was ratings, many have speculated that the controversy surrounding the marriage rumor played a role in the network's decision. Job offers dried up. The phone stopped ringing as frequently. Jim Nabors, who had been one of the most recognizable and bankable stars on television, suddenly found doors closing in his face, and all because of a rumor that wasn't even true. The psychological toll of this period cannot be overstated. Imagine being at the pinnacle of your profession, beloved by millions, and then watching it all potentially crumble because of a lie you can't effectively refute. The stress, the anxiety, the constant worry about whether this would be the thing that finally exposed his sexuality and ended everything he'd worked for. Jim Nabors retreated, becoming more private, more guarded, more careful than ever about his public image. He continued to perform, continued to work, but the easy joy that had characterized his early career was tempered now by caution and a deep-seated fear of further exposure. But here's what makes Jim Nabors' story so remarkable, so ultimately triumphant despite the pain. He found love, real, enduring, transformative love. In 1975, just a few years after the devastating rumor that had threatened his career, Jim Nabors met a man named Stan Cadwallader. Stan was a Hawaii firefighter, someone completely outside the entertainment industry, someone genuine and grounded and real. Their meeting happened in Hawaii, where Jim had purchased property and was spending more and more of his time, drawn by the island's beauty and the sense of peace and privacy they offered. Stan was younger than Jim, in his mid-20s when they met, while Jim was in his mid-40s, but the connection between them was immediate and profound. Here was someone who didn't care about Hollywood, who didn't care about fame or image or public perception. Stan loved Jim for who he was, not for Gomer Pyle or for the wholesome television star, but for the man behind the character. Their relationship began quietly, conducted with the same secrecy that Jim had maintained his entire adult life. Stan would eventually move to the mainland to be closer to Jim, and the two began building a life together, a real life with all the mundane joys and challenges that any couple faces. But they did it in secret, hidden from public view, because the world still wasn't ready to accept what they'd found together. Jim continued to work, making guest appearances on shows like The Carol Burnett Show, continuing his tradition of singing back home again in Indiana before the Indianapolis 500 race, a tradition he had started in 1972 and would continue for 36 consecutive years, and occasionally taking small acting roles. But increasingly, his primary residence was in Hawaii, where he and Stan could live more openly, where they had friends who knew and accepted their relationship, where they could simply be themselves without the constant fear of exposure. The years passed, and through them all, Stan and Jim remained together. Through the 1980s, when the AIDS crisis devastated the gay community and Rock Hudson himself became one of its most high-profile victims, dying from AIDS-related complications on October 2nd, 1985, at age 59. Hudson's death and his revelation shortly before it that he was suffering from AIDS shocked the world and forced America to confront both the AIDS crisis and the reality of closeted gay stars in a way it never had before. For Jim Nabors, who had distanced himself from the false marriage rumor but who had been friends with Hudson, it must have been a bittersweet moment, watching his old friend's sexuality become public knowledge only in death, seeing the way the world responded with a mixture of shock, sympathy, and in some quarters, condemnation. Jim and Stan weathered the 1990s together, years in which Jim dealt with his own serious health scare. In 1994, while traveling in India, Jim contracted hepatitis B, allegedly from shaving with a straight razor that cut his face. The disease ravaged his liver, and he required a transplant to survive. It was Stan who was there through the frightening diagnosis, the search for a donor, the surgery itself, and the long recovery. The experience, by all accounts, deepened their bond, reminding them both how precious and how fragile life could be. They had been together for nearly 20 years by this point, building a relationship that had lasted longer than many marriages, but still without any legal recognition, still without the ability to publicly acknowledge what they meant to each other. As the new millennium arrived, the world was slowly, gradually beginning to change. The conversation around LGBTQ rights was shifting, driven by activists who had been fighting for decades, by changing cultural attitudes, and by the simple accumulation of personal stories that helped people understand that love was love, regardless of gender. Jim Nabors, now in his 70s, watched these changes from his home in Hawaii, seeing a younger generation of actors and public figures come out without facing the career destruction that would have awaited them in his youth. Ellen DeGeneres came out in 1997, facing significant backlash, but surviving professionally. Other actors, musicians, and public figures began living openly, and while discrimination certainly still existed, the absolute career death sentence that being openly gay had once represented was beginning to fade. Still, Jim remained private about his relationship with Stan. It was a habit formed over decades, a protective instinct that didn't disappear just because the world was changing. They had built their life together in relative privacy, and there seemed little reason to change that now, in what Jim surely assumed would be the twilight years of his life. He continued to make occasional public appearances, delighting fans who remembered Gomer Pyle with affection. His voice still remarkable even as he aged, that rich baritone that could make the impossible dream sound like a prayer. But then came 2012, and with it, a moment that would change everything for Jim and Stan. Washington state legalized same-sex marriage, one of the first states in the nation to do so. Suddenly, for the first time in their 38 years together, Jim Nabors and Stan Cadwallader had the legal option to marry. They could make their commitment official, could have their relationship recognized by the law, could enjoy the same rights and protections that heterosexual couples had always taken for granted. For Jim, who had hidden his sexuality for his entire public life, who had weathered the false Rock Hudson marriage rumor and its consequences, who had watched friends die during the AIDS crisis, and wondered if he would ever see a day when he could live openly, this was a moment of profound significance. On January 15th, 2013, Jim Nabors, 82 years old, and Stan Cadwallader, 64, traveled to Seattle, Washington, and were married at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in a small private ceremony. It was intimate and quiet, just the way they had lived their entire relationship, but it was also deeply meaningful in ways that perhaps only people who had waited decades for such recognition could fully appreciate. Jim later told Hawaii News Now, in one of the few interviews he gave about the marriage, "I'm 82 and he's in his 60s, and so we've been together for 38 years, and I'm not ashamed of people knowing. It's just that it was such a personal thing, I didn't tell anybody. I'm very happy that I've had a partner of 38 years, and I feel very blessed. And what can I tell you? I'm just overjoyed." Read those words again. I'm not ashamed of people knowing. After a lifetime of secrecy, after decades of hiding, after the trauma of false rumors and career consequences, Jim Nabors was finally able to acknowledge his relationship publicly. He didn't make a big announcement, didn't hold a press conference, didn't seek publicity. The news came out when a local reporter learned about the marriage and asked him about it. But once it was out there, Jim didn't run from it. He acknowledged it simply and honestly, expressing the joy of finally being able to call Stan his husband after 38 years of partnership. The public reaction was telling. Unlike the destructive whispers of 1971, unlike the career-threatening scandal of a false marriage rumor, the news of Jim's real marriage in 2013 was met largely with warmth and support. Fans expressed happiness for him. Fellow entertainers sent congratulations. The world had changed, slowly but surely, and Jim Nabors, who had suffered from the prejudices of an earlier era, was now able to benefit from the progress that had been made. It wasn't universal acceptance. There were still those who expressed disapproval or disappointment, clinging to the wholesome image of Gomer Pyle, and refusing to accept the reality of the man who had played him. But the overwhelming response was positive, a recognition that Jim Nabors deserved happiness, and that his long partnership with Stan was something to be celebrated, not condemned. Jim lived another 4 years after his marriage, for years in which he and Stan could finally live as a legally recognized couple. He died on November 30th, 2017, at his home in Hawaii at the age of 87, with Stan by his side. His death was attributed to natural causes, his immune system having declined over the year preceding his death. The tributes that poured in remembered him as a talented performer, a gifted singer, and a genuinely kind person who brought joy to millions. Many also noted the bravery of his late-in-life decision to publicly acknowledge his marriage, recognizing the significance of that act for someone of his generation. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable, what elevates it beyond just another Hollywood tale of closet performers and changing times. The false rumor about Jim Nabors marrying Rock Hudson, the vicious gossip that had threatened his career and caused him such pain in 1971, had actually started as a joke within the gay community itself. It was dark humor born of frustration and impossibility, a satirical comment on the absurdity of their situation. But when it escaped into the wider world, it became a weapon that was used against the very people it had been meant to console. Jim Nabors spent decades living with the consequences of that rumor, watching opportunities disappear, feeling the weight of suspicion and judgment, all because of something that was completely false. The tragic irony is that when Jim Nabors actually did get married to someone he loved, when he made a real, legal, public commitment after 38 years of hidden partnership, the world barely blinked. The scandal that had been manufactured out of a false rumor in 1971 fizzled into nothing more than warm congratulations and good wishes in 2013. Everything Jim had feared, everything he protected himself against for decades, all the precautions and secrecy and careful image management, turned out to be based on a world that was already fading. By the time he finally felt safe enough to live openly, the consequences he had spent a lifetime dreading no longer existed in the same way. Think about what that means. Think about the years Jim and Stan could have lived more openly if the world had changed just a little bit faster. Think about the fear and secrecy that shaped their entire relationship, the inability to hold hands in public, to acknowledge each other at events, to introduce each other as partners rather than friends. Think about attending industry functions alone, because bringing Stan would raise questions about maintaining separate residences for appearances, about all the small and large ways that homophobia forced them to deny the reality of their love. And then think about how, in the end, when the truth finally came out, the sky didn't fall. His legacy wasn't destroyed. People still loved Gomer Pyle. They just also accepted that Jim Nabors was a gay man who had found lasting love with Stan Cadwallader. The story of Jim Nabors and the Rock Hudson marriage rumor is ultimately a story about the devastating cost of prejudice and secrecy. It's about how lies can wound just as surely as truth, and how living in fear of exposure creates its own kind of prison. But it's also a story about resilience, about finding love despite impossible circumstances, about the quiet heroism of maintaining a relationship for 38 years without any of the recognition or support that heterosexual couples take for granted. Jim and Stan didn't have big romantic gestures captured in magazine spreads. They didn't have wedding registries or public celebrations or anniversary parties with friends and family. They had each other in secret through decades of change and challenge, and they made it work through sheer commitment and love. When Jim finally revealed his marriage to Stan at 82 years old, he wasn't revealing a scandal. He was revealing a love story, one that had been unfolding quietly for nearly 4 decades while the world looked on unaware. The marriage to Rock Hudson had never happened. It was a fiction, a cruel joke that became an urban legend. But the marriage to Stan Cadwallader was beautifully, powerfully real, a testament to the human capacity for love and loyalty in the face of societal rejection and fear. In his final years, Jim got to experience something he'd been denied for most of his life. The simple dignity of having his relationship recognized, of being able to call Stan his husband, of living honestly and openly without fear. The fact that this recognition came so late in his life is both a triumph and a tragedy. It's a triumph because he got to experience it all, because he lived long enough to see the world change, to benefit from the activism and courage of those who had fought for LGBTQ rights, to finally marry the man he loved. But it's a tragedy because it came so late, because so many years had to be lived in secrecy, because the fear and prejudice of an earlier era stole from Jim and Stan the opportunity to build their life together openly from the beginning. How many dinners were eaten separately? How many holidays were spent apart or with carefully maintained pretenses? how many moments of joy were tempered by the constant need for discretion? The revelation that Jim Nabors made at 87 wasn't actually a revelation at all, because he had already married Stan 4 years earlier. But in many ways, his decision to acknowledge that marriage publicly, to tell the truth about his life after decades of carefully maintained privacy, was the most revealing thing he ever did. It said, "This is who I am. This is who I've always been. And this is the man I've loved for 38 years." It was simple, honest, and profound in its straightforwardness. No apologies, no long explanations. Just the truth presented plainly. I'm gay, I'm married, and I'm happy. For younger generations who have grown up in an era of increasing acceptance, who have seen marriage equality become the law of the land, who have watched openly gay and lesbian actors, musicians, and public figures thrive in their careers, it might be difficult to fully appreciate what Jim Nabors risked and what he endured. But for those who remember the 1960s and 70s, who lived through the AIDS crisis of the 1980s, who watched careers destroyed and lives ruined by exposure, Jim Nabors' story resonates with particular power. He represents a generation of LGBTQ people who had to make impossible choices, who had to weigh their authentic selves against their livelihoods, their safety, and their public reputations. Many chose secrecy, living double lives that took enormous psychological tolls. Some were exposed against their will, facing public humiliation and professional ruin. A few, the bravest or perhaps the most desperate, came out and faced the consequences head-on. Jim Nabors chose a middle path: secrecy in his public life, authenticity in his private one. He protected his career by maintaining the wholesome image that had made him famous, but he also built a real, loving relationship with Stan that sustained him through the decades. It was a compromise born of necessity, and like all compromises, it came with costs, but it also allowed him to have both things: a successful career that brought joy to millions and a personal life filled with love and partnership. Not everyone in his situation managed to achieve both. Rock Hudson, for instance, never found the lasting relationship that Jim had with Stan, despite his fame and fortune. The pressure and secrecy took different tolls on different people, and the fact that Jim and Stan made their relationship last for 38 years before legally marrying, and then continued together until Jim's death 4 years later, speaks to the strength of their bond and their commitment to each other. The marriage rumor with Rock Hudson, false though it was, had a strange kind of lasting impact. It became an urban legend that persists to this day, despite being thoroughly debunked. Snopes, the fact-checking website, has an entry dedicated to explaining that Jim Nabors and Rock Hudson never married, that they were simply friends, and that the rumor was baseless gossip. Yet the story continues to circulate, popping up in articles and videos, perpetuated by people who either don't know or don't care about the truth. In a weird way, the false rumor has become more famous than many of the true facts about Jim Nabors' life. People who might not know about his successful singing career, his decades-long tradition at the Indianapolis 500, or his variety show might still know about the supposed Rock Hudson marriage. It's a testament to the power of gossip in a way that salacious stories take on lives of their own, often overwhelming the more complex and interesting truths they obscure. What's particularly painful about this is that the false rumor about Rock Hudson eclipsed the true story of Stan Cadwallader for decades. While people were gossiping about a marriage that never happened, Jim and Stan were actually building a life together, facing all the real challenges and joys that come with a long-term relationship. Stan remained virtually unknown to the public until Jim's acknowledgement of their marriage in 2013, despite being Jim's partner for nearly 4 decades. He was the invisible man in Jim's life, present but unacknowledged, loving but unrecognized. The injustice of this, the way that a false story got more attention than the true love story unfolding in Jim's life, is one of the more bitter aspects of this entire narrative. When Jim died in 2017, Stan was identified in obituaries as his husband, a simple designation that represented decades of waiting and hoping. Stan, who had been by Jim's side through illnesses and triumphs, through quiet years in Hawaii and occasional returns to the spotlight, finally got the public recognition that had been denied him for so long. He inherited Jim's estate, including their beloved home in Hawaii, and by all accounts has lived quietly there since Jim's passing, maintaining the privacy that he and Jim had always valued. Stan has not sought publicity or attention. He seems content to be remembered simply as Jim's husband, the role he played privately for 38 years before it could be acknowledged publicly. Looking back at Jim Nabors' life from a vantage point of 2025, several things become clear. First, the false rumor about marrying Rock Hudson was both damaging and, in a strange way, less destructive than it could have been. It hurt Jim's career and caused him significant personal pain, but it didn't completely destroy him professionally. He continued to work, to perform, to maintain his status as a beloved entertainer, even if some opportunities were lost and some relationships were strained. In some ways, the ambiguity of the situation, the fact that he never confirmed or denied the rumors explicitly, may have actually protected him by keeping the question unresolved in people's minds. Second, the true story of Jim and Stan's relationship is far more interesting and meaningful than any rumor or gossip ever could be. A love that lasts 38 years and then continues through a late-in-life marriage until death, a partnership that weathered societal disapproval, career pressures, serious health crises, and all the ordinary challenges that any relationship faces, is remarkable by any standard. The fact that it had to be hidden for so long, that it was built and maintained in secrecy, only makes it more impressive. Jim and Stan created something beautiful and lasting in a world that told them what they had wasn't valid, wasn't real, wasn't worthy of recognition. They proved that world wrong simply by continuing to love each other, day after day, year after year, until finally, mercifully, the world changed enough to acknowledge what had been true all along. Third, Jim Nabors' decision to publicly acknowledge his marriage in his 80s was an act of quiet courage that shouldn't be overlooked. He could have continued to maintain his privacy. Many people would have understood and supported that choice. He had spent his entire career being private about his personal life, and he certainly didn't owe the public an explanation or confirmation. But by choosing to acknowledge his marriage to Stan, by speaking simply and honestly about their relationship, Jim provided representation and validation for countless older LGBTQ people who had also lived much of their lives in secrecy. He demonstrated that it's never too late to live authentically, that even at 82 years old, there is value and dignity in being honest about who you are and who you love. The title at 87, Jim Nabors finally reveals his marriage to Rock Hudson, and it's not good, is intentionally provocative, designed to catch attention. But here's the truth that's actually not good. Jim Nabors never married Rock Hudson. That rumor, which caused so much pain and nearly derailed his career in 1971, was completely false. What Jim actually did was marry Stan Cadwallader at age 82, after 38 years of partnership, in a ceremony that represented hope and progress and the triumph of love over fear. And what's truly not good about this entire story isn't any scandal or revelation about Jim's personal life. What's not good is the decades he had to spend hiding, the years of secrecy forced upon him by a society that wasn't ready to accept him, the false rumors that threatened his career, and the fact that he and Stan had to wait until they were elderly men to have their relationship legally recognized and publicly acknowledged. Jim Nabors' story is a reminder of how far we've come as a society and how much further we still have to go. While marriage equality is now the law of the land in the United States, while representation of LGBTQ people in media has increased dramatically, while younger generations are growing up with greater acceptance and understanding, there are still people facing the kinds of choices Jim faced, still careers being threatened, still families being torn apart, still individuals being forced to choose between authenticity and safety. Jim's story, spanning from his birth in 1930 to his death in 2017, encompasses nearly the entire arc of modern LGBTQ rights movement in America, from total legality and social condemnation to legal marriage and growing acceptance. He lived long enough to benefit from changes he could never have imagined in his youth, but not without paying a significant price along the way. The false rumor about Rock Hudson and the true story of Stan Cadwallader are forever intertwined in Jim Nabors' biography, the lie and the truth existing side by side, each illuminating something important about the world Jim navigated and the choices he made. The rumor shows the danger and destructive power of gossip in a homophobic society, the way that even false allegations could threaten careers and lives. The true story of Stan shows the resilience of love, the power of commitment, and the human capacity to build something beautiful even in hostile circumstances. Together, They tell a story that is uniquely Jim Nabors, but that also speaks to universal themes of authenticity, fear, love, and the slow, painful, hopeful progress of social change. As we remember Jim Nabors today, we should remember all of him, Gomer Pyle and the man who played him, the gifted singer with a remarkable baritone voice, and the private individual who protected his personal life fiercely, the television star beloved by millions, and the man who found lasting love with Stan Cadwallader. We should remember the false rumor and the true marriage, understanding how both shaped his life and legacy. And we should recognize that Jim's story, while specific to his time and circumstance, offers lessons that remain relevant about the cost of prejudice, the power of love, the importance of authenticity, and the possibility of change. Jim Nabors lived long enough to see a world where he could finally, legally, publicly marry the man he had loved for 38 years. Not everyone is so fortunate. His story reminds us why that matters, why the fight for equality and acceptance continues to be worth fighting, and why truth, even when it comes late, is always better than comfortable lies.